Monaco, December 3, 1999. 4:45 in the morning. Smoke begins curling through the corridors of La Belle Époque, one of the most secure residential buildings in Europe. Inside, behind reinforced walls and blast-resistant doors, a 67-year-old man waits for rescue. Edmund Safra controls assets worth billions. He employs former intelligence operatives. His penthouse security system cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. None of it will matter. By dawn, he will be dead. So will Vivian Torrente, the nurse who followed him into that fortified room. They will die not from violence, but from smoke. They will die waiting for help that arrives too late. They will die in a sanctuary built specifically to keep them alive. Edmund Safra was not simply wealthy. Wealth is common in Monaco. He was something rarer, a banker whose reputation transcended institutions. His word meant more than contracts drawn up by attorneys at major firms. He had built an empire across 4 continents without ever being fully accepted by the establishment. He had survived corporate vendettas that would have destroyed lesser men. He had cooperated with federal investigators on cases that threatened dangerous people in Moscow. And in the final months of his life, he had negotiated the largest all-cash banking acquisition in history, $10.3 billion that would allow him to vanish into protected retirement. Then, weeks before the deal closed, someone set a fire in his home. The official investigation would eventually identify a single culprit, an American nurse named Ted Meyer, who had worked for Safra for less than 5 months. A man with no apparent connection to any of Safra's enemies. A man whose stated motive was so pathetic it seemed almost impossible to believe. He wanted recognition. He wanted to be seen as a hero. Instead, he staged an emergency that spiraled into catastrophe. But the official story has never satisfied everyone. Too many powerful people had reasons to want Edmund Safra dead. Too many convenient circumstances aligned on the night he died. Too many questions remain unanswered 25 years later. This is the story of a man who built a fortress and died inside it. A man who trusted almost no one and was betrayed by someone he barely knew. A man whose death still generates theories, whispers, and doubts that forensic evidence cannot resolve. Before we begin, please subscribe to support this work. Like the video if you find it valuable. And leave a comment if something strikes you as significant. Now, let's dive in. Chapter 1. The Man Who Needed No One. Edmund Safra did not come from the world he would eventually dominate. He arrived as an outsider and remained one for his entire life, even after accumulating a fortune that placed him among the wealthiest individuals on Earth. That outsider status shaped everything: his business philosophy, his paranoia, his survival instincts, and ultimately, perhaps, his death. He was born on August 6, 1932, in Beirut, Lebanon, into a family that had been in the banking business for generations. The Safras traced their financial lineage back to the Ottoman Empire, where they had financed trade caravans moving between Aleppo, Damascus, and Alexandria. Banking, for the Safras, was not merely a profession. It was identity, tradition, and survival strategy all woven together across centuries. Edmund's father, Jacob Safra, operated a small private bank in Beirut. The institution served a clientele that valued discretion above all else: merchants, traders, and families whose wealth crossed borders that governments could not always track. In that world, reputation mattered more than regulation. A banker's word was the only contract that truly mattered. If you said the money would be there, it had to be there. If you promised confidentiality, you took that promise to your grave. Edmund absorbed these lessons before he was old enough to understand their implications. The family was Sephardic Jewish, which placed them at the margins of both the Lebanese society they lived in and the Ashkenazi Jewish banking dynasties that dominated European finance. They belonged fully to neither world. This dual outsider status would mark Edmund for life. He would eventually become one of the most powerful bankers in the world, yet he would never be invited into the inner circles of Wall Street or the old European houses. They respected him. They did business with him. They never truly accepted him. Political instability in Lebanon during the late 1940s convinced Jacob Safra that his children needed options beyond Beirut. He sent Edmund, then just 15 years old, to Milan, with modest capital and a network of contacts. The boy spoke Arabic, French, and some English. He did not speak Italian. He knew almost no one in the city. What he possessed was an understanding of how money moved, where inefficiencies existed, and how patient capital could exploit those inefficiencies without taking reckless risks. Edmund began trading gold. The post-war European economy was rebuilding, currencies were unstable, and gold represented one of the few stores of value that transcended national borders. He studied price differentials between markets. He identified arbitrage opportunities that veteran traders overlooked because the margins seemed too thin to bother with. But thin margins, repeated consistently across hundreds of transactions, accumulated into substantial profits. Within a few years, the teenager from Beirut had multiplied his small stake into something significant. In 1956, at the age of 24, Edmund Safra founded the Trade Development Bank in Geneva, Switzerland. The choice of location was deliberate. Switzerland offered political neutrality, banking secrecy laws that were already legendary, and a regulatory environment that respected discretion. Geneva, specifically, had become the private banking capital of Europe, serving clients who needed to move assets across borders without attracting government attention. Safra started with capital of approximately $1 million, substantial but not extraordinary in the world of Swiss banking. What set him apart was not the size of his initial fund, but his operating philosophy. While other banks were beginning to embrace leverage, complex instruments, and aggressive growth strategies, Safra operated as if it were still the 19th century. He knew his depositors personally. He avoided speculative investments. He maintained capital reserves far above regulatory requirements. He focused obsessively on a single metric, ensuring that depositors could withdraw their funds at any time without delay or complication. This approach was unfashionable even then. Banking was becoming modern, sophisticated, scientific. Safra's methods seemed quaint, old world, unnecessarily cautious. But they worked. Trade Development Bank grew steadily, year after year, through word-of-mouth referrals. One wealthy client would tell another that this quiet Lebanese banker in Geneva could be trusted absolutely. Your money was safe. Your secrets were safe. When you needed your funds, they would be there. His client base reflected his own outsider status. He served Latin American industrialists whose governments were unstable. He served Middle Eastern royalty whose fortunes needed protection from political upheaval. He served old European money that valued discretion above returns. He built relationships that transcended transactions, knowing his clients' families, understanding their long-term needs, providing counsel that went beyond mere financial advice. By the early 1960s, Trade Development Bank had become one of the most respected private banking institutions in Switzerland. Respected, but not large. Safra had no interest in becoming the biggest bank. He wanted to be the most trusted. Those are not the same thing. But Geneva was only the foundation. In 1966, Edmund Safra expanded to New York, founding Republic National Bank. The American operation adopted a different strategy than the Swiss institution, though the underlying philosophy remained consistent. Rather than exclusively serving the ultra-wealthy, Republic built a retail network targeting immigrant communities, Brazilians, Greeks, Russians, people who understood what it meant to need a bank you could trust because governments and institutions had failed them before. The approach succeeded beyond expectations. Republic opened branches across the New York metropolitan area, growing steadily through the 1970s and 1980s. By the 1990s, it operated more than 80 locations, making it one of the largest branch networks in the region. Assets under management exceeded $30 billion. Edmund Safra had built something that Wall Street could no longer ignore. In 1988, he expanded further, establishing Safra Republic Holdings in Luxembourg as a European hub for private banking operations. The structure now spanned 3 continents, managed tens of billions in assets, and employed thousands of people. Yet the core philosophy never changed. Safra still knew many of his largest depositors personally. He still avoided the derivative instruments and complex securities that other banks were embracing. He still maintained reserves far above what regulators required. His caution proved prescient. When financial crises struck, the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s, the savings and loan collapse in the United States, various emerging market meltdowns, Safra's institutions remained stable. Depositors did not flee. The capital was always there. This consistency attracted more clients, who recognized that boring banking was valuable precisely because it was boring. Excitement in banking usually meant someone was taking risks with other people's money. By the mid-1990s, Edmund Safra's personal fortune exceeded $2.5 billion. His banking operations held many times that amount. He had become one of the most significant private bankers in the world, controlling institutions that served clients across 4 continents. He spoke 6 languages fluently. He moved comfortably between Geneva, New York, São Paulo, and Monaco. Yet he remained, in fundamental ways, an outsider. Wall Street did not embrace him. The old European banking families regarded him with a mixture of respect and wariness. He was Sephardic, Lebanese, secretive, and impossible to categorize. He belonged fully to no single place. This perpetual outsider status made him careful. It also made him enemies. When you control billions of dollars and operate across borders that governments struggle to monitor, powerful people pay attention. Some want to do business with you. Others want to destroy you. Edmund Safra would encounter both in the years ahead, and those encounters would shape the final chapter of his life in ways he could not have anticipated. But first, he had to survive an attack from one of the largest corporations in America. Chapter 2. The American Express War. In 1983, Edmund Safra made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time and would prove catastrophic in ways that took years to fully understand. He sold Trade Development Bank, his beloved Geneva institution, to American Express for approximately $450 million. The transaction made strategic sense on multiple levels. American Express wanted to expand aggressively into private banking, and Safra's institution represented a shortcut to credibility in that world. His client relationships, his reputation, and his operational expertise were worth the substantial price tag. For Safra, the sale provided liquidity and perhaps an opportunity to step back from the relentless demands of running a global operation. He was 51 years old. He had spent nearly 3 decades building the bank from nothing. The sale would make him extraordinarily wealthy and free him to pursue other interests. There was one critical condition embedded in the agreement. Safra promised not to compete in the private banking business for a specified period. The exact terms of this non-compete clause would later become a subject of dispute. What is clear is that both sides believed they understood what had been agreed to. Both sides were wrong. Edmund Safra did not enjoy retirement. The idea of stepping away from banking had appealed to him in theory. In practice, it proved unbearable. He was constitutionally incapable of sitting idle while others managed money. Banking was not merely his profession. It was his identity, his family's legacy, and the only arena where his skills mattered. Within 2 years of selling Trade Development, he had begun plotting his return. In 1985, Safra re-entered the banking business through Republic National Bank of New York, which he had founded in 1966 and retained control of throughout the Trade Development sale. He argued that the non-compete clause applied only to his Swiss operations, not to his American activities. Republic was a separate entity, operating under different regulatory structures in a different market. Returning to work there, he maintained, did not violate the agreement. American Express saw it differently. To the executives in Manhattan, Safra's return felt like betrayal. They had paid $450 million for his expertise, his client relationships, and his withdrawal from the competitive landscape. Now he was using all three to build a rival institution. Worse, some of his former Trade Development clients were following him to Republic, taking their assets with them. The corporate humiliation was profound. American Express had been outmaneuvered by a man they believed they had paid to disappear. What happened next would become one of the ugliest corporate vendettas in modern business history, a campaign so vicious and so well documented that it still serves as a case study in how not to handle competitive disputes. Beginning in late 1988, stories began appearing in newspapers and magazines linking Edmund Safra to criminal enterprises. The allegations were sensational and appeared across multiple publications in different countries, which gave them an air of credibility. If multiple independent sources were all reporting similar information, perhaps there was substance behind the claims. One report, published in October 1988 in the Italian magazine Panorama, suggested that Safra's institutions had laundered money connected to the Iran-Contra scandal, the Reagan administration's secret arms deals that had scandalized Washington. Another article, appearing in December 1988 in the French newspaper Minute, linked him to the Pizza Connection heroin trafficking case that had recently concluded in New York. A third report, published in The Nation in Thailand, implied connections between Safra's banks and Latin American drug cartels. The articles shared certain characteristics. They cited anonymous sources within law enforcement or intelligence communities. They offered no documentary evidence, no account numbers, no transaction records, no verified testimony. They relied heavily on innuendo, using phrases like "sources suggest" and "investigators believe" to make accusations without committing to verifiable facts. And they appeared in publications that had never previously shown significant interest in Swiss banking or international finance. Safra recognized immediately that something coordinated was happening. These were not random acts of journalism. The allegations were too similar, appeared too close together, and followed patterns that suggested deliberate orchestration. He hired investigators of his own, former intelligence operatives and forensic specialists who understood how disinformation campaigns operated. What they discovered was remarkable. The smear campaign traced directly back to American Express. The company had retained a private intelligence firm called Kroll Associates, which in turn had hired operatives who specialized in planting stories with journalists. These operatives created fictitious sources, fabricated connections between Safra and criminal enterprises, and fed information to reporters who were either complicit or insufficiently skeptical. One of the key figures in the operation was a man named Antonio Greco, who worked for a public relations firm that American Express had contracted. Greco had approached journalists in multiple countries with tips about Safra's alleged criminal connections. He provided documents that appeared to be leaked from law enforcement sources, but were, in fact, fabrications. He cultivated relationships with reporters who were willing to publish sensational allegations without rigorous verification. The operation was sophisticated, well-funded, and deliberately designed to destroy Edmund Safra's reputation, the very foundation upon which his entire career had been built. In private banking, reputation is the only asset that truly matters. A banker, whose name appears in articles about drug cartels and arms dealers, cannot function, regardless of whether the allegations are true. Clients flee, regulators investigate, counterparties refuse to do business. The damage is done before any factual determination can be made. Safra responded with overwhelming legal force. His attorneys, assembled from top-tier firms in multiple jurisdictions, filed lawsuits and began gathering evidence. What they compiled was methodical and devastating. They documented every planted story. They traced payments from American Express to the intelligence operatives. They identified the fabricated sources and demonstrated how the disinformation had been created and disseminated. They built a case that would have destroyed American Express in court. The company faced an impossible choice. They could fight the allegations, which would mean exposing the full scope of their campaign in public proceedings that the media would cover extensively, or they could settle quietly and hope the matter disappeared. They chose neither option. Instead, they did something almost unheard of in corporate litigation. On August 24, 1989, American Express issued a public apology. The statement, released to major news organizations and published in multiple newspapers, was extraordinary. The company admitted that unauthorized individuals acting on behalf of American Express had spread false information about Edmund Safra. They acknowledged that allegations linking him to criminal activities were baseless and had been planted deliberately. They agreed to pay $8 million to charities of Safra's choosing as restitution. $8 million meant nothing to a company of American Express's size. The admission meant everything. Major corporations do not publicly apologize for defaming competitors. They settle disputes with confidential agreements that include non-disclosure provisions. They pay money and move on without acknowledging wrongdoing. American Express had been forced to do something far more humiliating: admit, on the record, that they had tried to destroy a man through lies. The business press covered the apology extensively. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page story. The New York Times published a detailed account of the campaign. Business schools would later teach the case as an example of corporate misconduct. Edmund Safra had not merely survived the attack. He had forced one of the largest companies in the world to publicly acknowledge what they had done. But the victory came at a cost that was not immediately apparent. The episode changed Safra in fundamental ways. Before American Express, he had understood that success created jealousy and that competitors sometimes played rough. After American Express, he understood something darker. Major institutions would spend millions to annihilate him if they believed it served their interests. The rules of civilized competition did not apply when sufficient money was at stake. The only protection was vigilance, documentation, and the resources to fight back. His security arrangements, always careful, grew more elaborate. His willingness to engage with the business establishment diminished. His circle of trusted advisors shrank. He had seen what powerful forces were capable of when they felt threatened, and he had no reason to believe American Express was the only institution willing to operate that way. This lesson would prove relevant in the years ahead. The American Express vendetta was not the last time powerful forces would target Edmund Safra, but it established a pattern that investigators would later find significant. The man who died in Monaco in 1999 had spent decades accumulating enemies. Some he knew about. Others operated in shadows he could not penetrate. And the question that would haunt the final chapter of his life was whether one of those enemies had finally succeeded where American Express had failed. Chapter 3. The woman who survived Edmund Safra was not the only figure in that Monaco penthouse whose past invited scrutiny. His wife, Lily, had lived a life that tabloids found irresistible and investigators found curious. She was a woman who had been married 4 times, widowed twice under circumstances that generated whispers, and who would inherit hundreds of millions of dollars from the husband who died while she slept safely on the opposite side of their residence. Lily Watkins was born on December 30th, 1934, in Porto Alegre, a city in southern Brazil far from the centers of wealth and power. The details of her early years remain sketchy, obscured by time and perhaps by deliberate vagueness. What is clear is that she possessed beauty, social intelligence, and an understanding of how wealth operates that would serve her extraordinarily well across 5 decades. Her first marriage, to a man named Wolf White Monteverde when she was still a teenager, ended quickly and left almost no trace in public records. Her second marriage would prove far more consequential. Alfredo Freddy Monteverde was substantially older than Lily, a successful businessman who had built a fortune through Ponto Frio, one of Brazil's largest retail chains. The company sold appliances and electronics across the country, capitalizing on Brazil's economic growth during the 1960s. They married in the early 1960s. Lily gave him 3 children and established herself in São Paulo's elite social circles. She learned how wealthy families operated, which charities mattered, how to host events that enhanced her husband's business relationships. For nearly a decade, she played the role of society wife with skill and dedication. Then, on June 6, 1969, Alfredo Monteverde died. The official ruling was suicide. He had been found with gunshot wounds in circumstances that authorities deemed self-inflicted. The investigation was brief. The conclusion seemed clear. A wealthy businessman had taken his own life for reasons that remained private. His family did not believe it. The Monteverdes insisted that Alfredo had no reason to kill himself. His business was thriving. His health was sound. His relationship with his children was strong. Nothing in his behavior suggested despair. The family pointed to inconsistencies in the investigation, details that did not align with suicide. They questioned whether a man would choose such a violent end when nothing in his circumstances justified it. Their suspicions focused on Lily. No charges were ever filed. No evidence directly implicated her. Brazilian authorities closed the case and moved on. But the Monteverde family never accepted the verdict, and their doubts became part of the permanent record surrounding Lily Watkins Monteverde. Journalists who investigated her background decades later would invariably mention the circumstances of Alfredo's death, the family's suspicions, and the unresolved questions that lingered. Lily did not remain a widow for long. Her third husband was Samuel Bendahan, another wealthy Brazilian. The union was brief, produced no children, and generated little public attention. It ended in divorce. By the mid-1970s, Lily had been married 3 times, widowed once, divorced twice, and was still only in her early 40s. Her 4th marriage would define her public identity for the rest of her life. Edmund Safra and Lily met in 1976, though the exact circumstances of their introduction vary depending on who tells the story. Some accounts suggest they were introduced by mutual friends in São Paulo's banking community. Others claim they met at a social event in Europe. What is certain is that by 1976, they were married. She was 42. He was 44. Neither had children from previous marriages who might complicate inheritance matters. It was a union between 2 people who understood precisely what they wanted from life and from each other. For Edmund, Lily offered something his fortune could not buy: social grace. She understood how to transform a house into a showcase worthy of architectural magazines. She knew which artists to patronize, which charities to support, how to host dinners where business was conducted without appearing to conduct business. Their homes in Monaco, London, Geneva, and New York became settings where culture and commerce intersected seamlessly. She cultivated relationships with museum directors, orchestra conductors, and European aristocracy. If Edmund was the engine of their wealth, Lily was its most visible ambassador. For Lily, Edmund offered legitimacy. Whatever shadows clung to her past, the whispers about Alfredo Monteverde, the string of marriages, the questions about her origins, marriage to one of the world's most respected bankers provided a shield of respectability. The Safra name opened doors that Monteverde money never could. She became Lily Safra, philanthropist and patron of the arts, rather than Lily Monteverde, the widow whose husband's family still doubted the official story. By all accounts, the marriage functioned well. Friends described genuine affection between them, a partnership that balanced Edmund's obsessive work habits with Lily's social commitments. They hosted elaborate dinner parties. They supported causes together. They traveled extensively, dividing time between their multiple residences. When Edmund's Parkinson's disease began manifesting symptoms in the late 1980s, Lily managed an expanding staff of medical professionals with the same attention to detail she applied to household management. The arrangement was practical in many ways. As Edmund's condition worsened through the 1990s, requiring round-the-clock medical attention, maintaining separate sleeping quarters made sense. His care involved nurses entering at all hours, equipment that generated noise, medications administered on schedules that disrupted sleep. Sharing a bedroom would have been impractical for both of them. Many couples in similar circumstances maintained separate quarters without anyone questioning the arrangement. But when fire broke out in the Monaco penthouse in the early hours of December 3, 1999, the separate sleeping arrangements took on different significance. Lily occupied a suite on the opposite end of the residence from Edmund. She escaped without injury, making her way to a balcony where firefighters rescued her. Her husband died in his reinforced bathroom, overcome by smoke while waiting for help that arrived too late. The security footage from cameras that might have documented exactly what happened that night was never recovered. Technical explanations were offered: equipment malfunction, the fire's heat-damaging recording systems. But the absence of video evidence meant that key questions about the sequence of events could never be definitively answered. Lily Safra inherited the bulk of her husband's estate, estimated at approximately $800 million after the HSBC transaction closed. She devoted the next 23 years to philanthropy, donating hundreds of millions to medical research, education, and the arts. The Edmund J. Safra Foundation, which she expanded dramatically after his death, operates across more than 40 countries. She funded hospitals, university programs, and research centers that bear the Safra name. Her charitable work was genuine, substantial, and transformative for countless institutions. She never remarried. She maintained residences in Monaco, London, and the south of France. She continued hosting events and supporting causes until her health began failing in her 80s. She died on July 9, 2022, at the age of 87, having outlived Edmund by nearly 23 years. Her obituaries focused on her philanthropy. The major newspapers published respectful accounts of her charitable contributions and the institutions she had supported. But many of those same articles included paragraphs near the end noting the circumstances of Edmund's death, the suspicions that had never entirely disappeared, and the Monteverde family's enduring doubts about what had happened to Alfredo more than half a century earlier. Lily Safra was never charged with any crime. No evidence ever emerged directly implicating her in any wrongdoing. She spent decades building a legacy of giving that is beyond dispute. And yet the whispers followed her to the grave. Some lives accumulate questions that no amount of charitable work can fully erase. Chapter 4. Russian Labyrinths. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 created one of the largest criminal opportunities in human history. State assets worth hundreds of billions of dollars passed into private hands almost overnight through processes that bore only passing resemblance to legitimate privatization. The men who seized these assets, oil fields worth billions, aluminum smelters that employed entire cities, telecommunications networks that spanned continents, needed somewhere to move their new fortunes. They needed discretion. They needed access to Western financial markets. And they needed institutions that understood how to manage wealth that originated in places where laws were suggestions rather than constraints. Edmund Safra's banking operations offered precisely what these new Russian billionaires required. Republic National Bank of New York and its affiliated entities in Geneva and Luxembourg had built their reputations serving clients who valued privacy above transparency. The infrastructure that worked for Latin American industrialists whose governments were unstable and Middle Eastern royalty whose fortunes needed protection from political upheaval worked equally well for the oligarchs emerging from post-Soviet chaos. Money began flowing through Safra's institutions in quantities that were extraordinary even by the standards of private banking. Accounts held tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions, in assets whose origins were difficult to trace and potentially impossible to verify. Not all of this money was clean. In the Russia of the 1990s, the distinction between legitimate business and organized crime was often meaningless. The oligarchs who controlled billion-dollar enterprises employed the same enforcers, paid the same bribes, and eliminated the same obstacles as traditional mafia structures. Violence was not an aberration in this world. It was standard business practice. Contract killings in Moscow became so common that newspapers ran tallies like sports statistics. Banking executives, journalists, politicians, and businessmen were shot in their cars, in their offices, in their apartment buildings. The murders were not random street crime. They were professional eliminations carried out by networks that operated with near impunity. The message was clear: challenge the wrong people, and you disappeared. Safra found himself in an impossible position. His institutions held accounts that generated enormous fees, millions of dollars annually in management and transaction costs. Some of those accounts almost certainly contained proceeds from corruption, extortion, or worse. Closing them meant losing revenue and potentially making dangerous enemies. Men who had killed competitors in Moscow would not hesitate to target a banker in Geneva if they believed he threatened their interests. Keeping the accounts meant potential complicity in crimes he could not fully understand, and regulatory violations that could destroy his reputation and his institutions if exposed. The Russian money laundering operation that would eventually ensnare multiple American banks began surfacing in 1998. Investigators at the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been tracking suspicious transactions flowing through Bank of New York accounts, billions of dollars moving in patterns that suggested deliberate efforts to disguise origins and destinations. The amounts were staggering. Over a 3-year period, approximately $4.8 billion had passed, through accounts controlled by Russian nationals and entities connected to them. Some of this money came from an International Monetary Fund loan intended to stabilize the Russian economy during its 1998 financial crisis. Instead of supporting the currency or funding government operations, the funds had been diverted, laundered through shell companies, and scattered across dozens of accounts in multiple jurisdictions. Russian government officials were implicated. So were organized crime figures with direct ties to the Kremlin. The scandal, when it finally became public, would represent one of the largest financial frauds in history. Edmund Safra was not directly involved in the Bank of New York scheme. But his institutions had served Russian clients whose connections to the broader network were undeniable. And at some point in 1998, Safra made a decision that would define the final year of his life. He contacted the FBI. He provided information about suspicious transactions flowing through accounts at his banks. He identified patterns that suggested money laundering on a massive scale. He became a cooperating witness in one of the most significant financial crime investigations of the decade. The decision was extraordinary for several reasons. Safra had spent his entire career valuing discretion above all else. His business model depended on clients trusting that their financial information would never be disclosed without their permission. Cooperating with federal investigators violated that fundamental principle. Yet he did it anyway, apparently concluding that the risks of remaining silent exceeded the risks of speaking. What motivated him remains unclear. Perhaps he recognized that Russian money had become too dangerous, that the amounts and the clients were drawing regulatory attention he could not deflect. Perhaps he genuinely believed that helping expose criminal networks was the right thing to do. Perhaps he calculated that cooperating early would provide protection if the broader investigation eventually reached his institutions. Whatever his reasoning, the decision placed him in direct conflict with some of the most dangerous people on Earth. The networks he helped expose did not respond to threats the way American corporations did. There were no lawsuits, no public relations campaigns, no negotiated settlements. When someone threatened Russian oligarchs with connections to organized crime and Kremlin intelligence services, that person often suffered accidents. Car bombs, poisonings, falls from windows, shootings staged to look like robberies. The methods varied. The outcomes did not. Whether Safra fully understood the danger he had placed himself in remains an open question. He was accustomed to enemies who fought with planted newspaper stories and courtroom battles, the way American Express had attacked him. The Russian networks operated by different rules entirely. They had no shareholders to answer to, no corporate reputation to protect, no legal constraints that could not be circumvented through bribery or violence. They were, in many respects, beyond the reach of Western law enforcement. By late 1999, Edmund Safra occupied a uniquely dangerous position. He had cooperated with the FBI on an investigation that threatened powerful people in Moscow. He controlled information that could implicate Russian nationals in massive financial crimes. He was weeks away from completing the sale of his institutions to HSBC, which meant his knowledge would soon be in the hands of a different organization, potentially making him less valuable as a target, or more urgent to eliminate, while his testimony still mattered. He died on December 3, 1999, approximately 18 months after first contacting federal investigators about Russian money laundering. The timing has been noted by multiple journalists and investigators over the years. No definitive evidence has emerged linking Russian networks to his death. But the possibility has never been entirely dismissed either. What is certain is this: Edmund Safra helped expose people who were accustomed to killing anyone who threatened their interests. He did so while living in a penthouse with elaborate security that would have made a direct assault difficult, but not impossible. And he died in a fire that was blamed on a single disturbed employee, under circumstances that continue generating skepticism decades later. The Russian networks that Safra helped investigate are still operating. Some of the oligarchs from that era are dead, victims of political purges or underworld violence. Others are wealthier and more powerful than ever, operating global empires from London, Monaco, and other cities where money buys protection and discretion. Whether any of them ever decided that Edmund Safra needed to be eliminated remains unknown. What is known is that they had the motive, the capability, and a demonstrated willingness to use violence when it served their purposes. The fire in Monaco may have been exactly what prosecutors claimed, a staged emergency gone horribly wrong, conceived by a disturbed nurse seeking recognition. Or it may have been something else entirely, an operation that succeeded because it was designed to look like the actions of a lone incompetent. The truth may never be established with certainty, but dismissing the Russian connection entirely requires ignoring both the timing and the nature of the people Safra had chosen to expose. Chapter 5. The Sale. By early 1999, Edmund Safra had decided to do something he had never done before in his entire professional life. He was going to walk away. The decision was partly medical. His Parkinson's disease, diagnosed in the late 1980s, had progressed steadily throughout the 1990s. The tremors, the rigidity, the cognitive effects that came and went unpredictably. These were not conditions suited to running global financial institutions. The disease forced him to rely increasingly on staff for tasks he had always managed himself. His handwriting, once precise, had become nearly illegible. His movements were slow and required assistance. The man who had spent 5 decades building a reputation for absolute control was losing control of his own body. The decision was also strategic. Safra understood consolidation. The financial services industry was changing fundamentally. Smaller private institutions were being absorbed by massive global conglomerates that could offer retail banking, investment services, insurance products, and wealth management all under one roof. The personal relationships that had built his career, knowing clients' families, understanding their long-term needs, providing counsel that transcended mere financial advice, were giving way to algorithmic trading, automated services, and institutional anonymity. He could fight this tide, or he could sell at what was likely the peak of his institution's value. The choice, when he considered it carefully, was obvious. He was 66 years old, sick and wealthy beyond any possible need. His banks were extraordinarily valuable to the right buyer. The opportunity to exit completely, on his terms, with his reputation intact, might not exist much longer. HSBC Holdings, the British-based banking giant with roots in Hong Kong and operations across Asia, emerged as the buyer. The bank was pursuing an aggressive expansion strategy in the late 1990s, acquiring institutions that could strengthen its position in key markets. Safra's operations offered exactly what HSBC wanted: a presence in private banking with established client relationships, particularly in Latin America, and a reputation for conservative management that aligned with HSBC's own culture. The negotiations were extraordinarily complex, spanning multiple jurisdictions and involving regulatory approvals in the United States, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. Safra's holdings included Republic New York Corporation and all its subsidiaries, Safra Republic Holdings in Luxembourg, and various affiliated entities across 3 continents. Untangling the ownership structures, valuing the client relationships, and determining which assets would be included in the transaction took months of detailed work. The final price was announced on May 10, 1999. $10.3 billion, paid entirely in cash. Financial journalists struggled to contextualize the figure. It was the largest cash acquisition of any financial institution in history. The number exceeded the gross domestic product of numerous nations. Edmund Safra, who had started with borrowed capital in a small Geneva office 4 decades earlier, was selling his life's work for more money than most people could conceptualize. The transaction was structured to close by the end of 1999 or early 2000, pending regulatory approvals. Safra would remain involved during a transition period, helping HSBC integrate his client relationships and institutional knowledge into their global operations. He would introduce key clients to the new management, ensure that the cultural transition happened smoothly, and preserve the reputation that made his institutions valuable in the first place. After that transition, expected to last perhaps a year, he planned to retire completely. He and Lily would divide their time between Monaco and their villa in the south of France. He would focus on philanthropy, expanding the charitable foundation that already supported medical research, education, and Jewish cultural institutions. He would manage his health, traveling to specialists, trying new treatments, finding ways to slow the progression of the Parkinson's that was gradually stealing his mobility and independence. He would, for the first time in half a century, stop working. That future never arrived. On December 3, 1999, 7 months after announcing the HSBC transaction and weeks before it was scheduled to close, Edmund Safra died in his Monaco residence. He was 67 years old. The deal closed without him. His estate collected the $10.3 billion he would never spend. Many observers noted the timing. For decades, Safra had operated at the center of networks that included controversial clients, intelligence agencies, and shadowy financial flows. He had made enemies in American boardrooms and in the corridors of post-Soviet power. He had cooperated with federal investigators on cases that threatened dangerous people. He had accumulated information that could damage reputations and destroy careers. Yet he had survived all of it. The American Express vendetta had failed. The Russian entanglements had produced no visible consequences. He was weeks away from completing the largest transaction of his life and vanishing into comfortable obscurity. The HSBC sale would transfer his client relationships and operational knowledge to a different organization. His value as a target, whether for revenge, for silencing, or for any other purpose, would diminish substantially once the deal closed. He would become a retired billionaire with health problems, living quietly in Monaco, no longer at the center of anything that mattered. Then he burned to death in one of the most secure residential buildings in Europe, killed by a fire that investigators would eventually attribute to the actions of a single employee. Those who believed in coincidence saw an elderly man with a debilitating illness who died tragically in an accidental fire set by a disturbed nurse seeking recognition. Those who did not believe in coincidence saw something else entirely. A man with powerful enemies, a transaction worth more than $10 billion, a death that occurred at precisely the moment when killing him would still matter, before he faded into irrelevance, before his knowledge became stale, before the deal closed and the networks dissolved. Investigators would explore both possibilities. They would examine Safra's business dealings, his Russian connections, his cooperation with federal authorities, and his personal relationships. They would interrogate witnesses, analyze financial records, and reconstruct timelines. Their official conclusion would identify Ted Mayer as the sole responsible party, a lone actor whose pathetic attempt to stage a heroic rescue had spiraled into catastrophe. Many people accepted that conclusion. It was supported by Mayer's confession, by physical evidence at the scene, and by the absence of any proof linking other parties to the fire. But acceptance was not universal. The doubts that emerged in the immediate aftermath of Safra's death never entirely disappeared, and the questions that could not be definitively answered continued generating theories, speculation, and suspicion for decades afterward. Edmund Safra had spent his life managing risk. He understood how to protect assets, how to anticipate threats, how to build systems that could withstand almost any assault. What he could not protect against was the possibility that someone inside his fortress, someone he had hired and trusted with his care, would become the instrument of his destruction. Whether acting alone or serving purposes, he did not fully understand. Chapter 6. The Nurse Who Wanted More. Ted Marr got the job through sheer luck. In the spring of 1999, while working as a nurse in the neonatal intensive care unit at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York, Mayer found a camera that had been left behind in a discharged patient's room. Rather than turning it in to Lost and Found, he developed the film and tracked down the owners. The camera belonged to Laura and Harry Slatkin, who were overjoyed to recover the first photographs of their newborn twins. Harry Slatkin happened to be well connected to the Safra family through his mother-in-law, Adriana Elia, who was Lily Safra's stepdaughter from her second marriage. A recommendation followed. Within weeks, Ted Marr was interviewing for a position on Edmund Safra's private medical team. The timing could not have been better. He was 41 years old, deeply in debt from a divorce and custody battle over his oldest son, and facing an uncertain future at the hospital, where a nurses' strike was looming. The Safra opportunity seemed like a miracle. His background made him attractive to the household. Mayer had served in the United States Army from 1976 to 1986, with time in the Special Forces as a Green Beret. The Safras liked the idea of a nurse who could double as an informal protector, someone with both medical training and the physical capability to respond to threats if necessary. After his military service, Mayer had earned nursing degrees and eventually specialized in neonatal care. The combination of combat experience and clinical credentials was exactly what they wanted for someone who would be inside the residence during overnight shifts when fewer security personnel were present. The contract offered $600 per day. For Mayer, who had been earning roughly $60,000 annually at Columbia Presbyterian, the salary was life-changing. It meant more than $200,000 per year, enough to eliminate his debts, settle his legal obligations from the divorce, and build financial security for the first time in his adult life. There was one condition. He would have to relocate to Monaco and begin work immediately. He accepted in early August 1999. The household he entered operated unlike any workplace he had known. Edmund Safra required constant medical supervision for his advanced Parkinson's disease. A team of 7 or 8 nurses rotated through shifts, ensuring that qualified caregivers were present 24 hours a day. The penthouse at La Belle Époque functioned as both a residence and a medical facility, with equipment, medication schedules, and documentation requirements that demanded precision and consistency. The head nurse was Sonia Hercraft, a Frenchwoman who had been with the family for years and managed the medical staff with exacting standards. According to Mayer, Hercraft disliked him from the beginning. He believed she viewed him as an outsider who had gotten into the family's good graces through a personal connection rather than professional merit. She gave him conflicting instructions, he later claimed, setting him up to make mistakes that would reflect poorly on his performance. She altered his schedule between day and night shifts with little notice, keeping him off balance and unable to establish any routine. Whether Hercraft's hostility was real or imagined, Mayer felt persecuted. Those who worked alongside him saw a man who craved recognition he had not earned. He told elaborate stories about his Special Forces service that colleagues found difficult to verify and occasionally implausible. He positioned himself as more capable and more experienced than his brief tenure justified. When he felt overlooked, he made sure people noticed his displeasure. The gap between how Ted Marr perceived himself as a highly trained professional with military experience that set him apart, and how others perceived him as the newest and least trusted member of the team, was considerable. By late November 1999, Marr had grown convinced that his position was in jeopardy. He believed that Hercraft was documenting his mistakes and building a case for his dismissal. The generous salary that had rescued him from financial ruin now felt precarious. If he lost this job after less than 6 months, he would return to New York with nothing to show for the disruption, facing the same debts and the same uncertain future at a hospital where his colleagues would know he had failed. A different person might have worked harder, kept quiet, and waited for circumstances to improve. Ted Mayer devised a plan. The logic, such as it was, made a terrible kind of sense to him. If the Safras faced a threat and he was the one who saved them, everything would change. The doubters would be silenced. Sonia Hercraft's hostility would become irrelevant. His value would be obvious to everyone. He would transform from the newest and least trusted member of the team into the hero who had protected the family when it mattered most. The plan was not complex. He would stage an intrusion, make it look like armed attackers had broken into the residence, fight them off despite being injured in the process, and save Edmund Safra from danger. The scenario needed to seem real enough to justify calling emergency services and creating a situation where his actions would appear heroic. But it also needed to be controlled enough that no one would actually be harmed. On the night of December 2nd, 2099, Meyer was scheduled at the last minute to work the overnight shift due to another nurse calling in sick. Edmund Safra was sleeping in his medical suite. Lily Safra was in her separate quarters on the opposite end of the residence. The only other staff member present was Vivian Torrente, one of the senior nurses who represented everything Meyer believed was working against him, experienced, trusted, and skeptical of his abilities. The building was quiet. The security systems were armed. Nothing suggested that anything unusual would occur. What Ted Maher set in motion over the next 18 minutes would kill 2 people, destroy his own future, and generate questions that have never been fully answered. He wanted to be a hero. He wanted the Safras to see him the way he saw himself. Instead, he became a killer. Chapter 7. 18 Minutes of Fire. The sequence began sometime after 4:30 in the morning on December 3rd, 1999. Ted Maher was alone in the nursing station adjacent to Edmund Safra's medical suite when he made his final decision. The apartment was quiet. Safra was sleeping. Lily was in her separate quarters. Vivian Torrente was monitoring equipment nearby. The moment had arrived. Maher took out a switchblade and cut himself twice. The first wound was to his left thigh. The second was to his abdomen. Neither cut was deep enough to cause serious injury, but both produced bleeding that would look convincing. He needed injuries that appeared to result from a violent struggle. He needed to look like a man who had fought for his life against armed attackers. Then he went to find Vivian Torrente. His story was simple and terrifying. 2 masked intruders had broken into the apartment. They had attacked him with knives when he confronted them. He had fought them off, but they were still somewhere in the residence. Torrente needed to get Safra to safety immediately, while Meyer went to alert the authorities. Torrente did not question the story. There was no reason to. The Safra household operated under constant awareness that powerful people might want to harm their employer. Edmund Safra had enemies in corporate boardrooms and potentially in Moscow. An assassination attempt was not implausible. It was the scenario they had prepared for. She woke Safra and helped him to the secure bathroom adjacent to his bedroom. The space had been designed as a refuge during exactly this kind of emergency, a reinforced area where the family could shelter while security personnel dealt with threats. The walls were armored. The door was blast-resistant. Once sealed inside, they would be protected until help arrived. Torrente locked the door behind them and called Lily Safra's personal maid on the opposite end of the residence to warn her about the intruders. She believed they were safe now, protected by steel and concrete, waiting for a rescue that would surely arrive within minutes. Maher returned to the nursing station. His plan required an alarm, something that would bring police and firefighters rushing to the building. He gathered toilet paper and other flammable materials and placed them in a metal wastebasket. He struck a match. The flames were small, meant only to trigger the smoke detectors. A minor fire, quickly contained, enough to summon emergency responders who would arrive to find a bleeding nurse who had heroically fought off assassins. They would discover Edmund Safra safely protected in his secure room. The grateful billionaire would recognize Maher's courage. The doubters on the staff would be silenced forever. His position would be secure. That was the fantasy. Reality destroyed it in less than 18 minutes. The fire refused to stay contained. The flames spread faster than Maher had anticipated, reaching from the wastebasket to nearby papers, then to furnishings, then to curtains and walls. Smoke began filling the corridors with a speed and density he had never imagined. The penthouse, designed to be secure against intrusion, was not designed for rapid smoke evacuation. The reinforced construction and limited ventilation that made it defensible turned it into a trap. By the time Maher understood his mistake, the situation was already beyond salvage. Bleeding from his self-inflicted wounds, and increasingly faint from blood loss and smoke inhalation, he stumbled down the interior stairs to the lobby. When security personnel and the first police officers arrived moments later, he told them the same story he had told Torrente. Armed intruders had broken in, they had attacked him with knives, he had fought them off, and his employer was trapped somewhere above with masked men still hunting him. The officers believed him. Why wouldn't they? Here was a man bleeding from stab wounds, visibly injured, reporting a violent home invasion at one of the most secure buildings in Monaco. They had no reason to doubt his story. And that belief set in motion a rescue operation designed to save lives that instead guaranteed 2 people would die. Police treated the building as an active crime scene, with dangerous assailants still inside. They cleared the structure methodically, room by room, searching for attackers who existed only in Maher's fabrication. Firefighters held back, following protocols that required them to wait until police confirmed the area was secure before entering a scene involving armed suspects. Every procedure designed to protect first responders from violence now worked to delay their arrival at the one place where people were actually dying. Samuel Cohen, Safra's chief of security, arrived within minutes of being alerted. He had keys to the apartment. He knew the layout intimately. He could have led rescuers directly to the bathroom where his employer was trapped. Instead, the police detained him. They handcuffed the one person most capable of saving Safra's life and held him in the lobby while precious minutes vanished. The officers had no way to know who was legitimate security staff and who might be involved in the attack. In the confusion, they treated everyone as a potential threat. Inside the sealed bathroom, Edmund Safra and Vivian Torrente waited. The refugee that was supposed to protect them had become a death chamber. Smoke seeped through ventilation systems and under door frames. The reinforced walls that kept intruders out now prevented fresh air from entering. Carbon monoxide accumulated. The room filled slowly with toxic fumes, while its occupants made increasingly desperate phone calls begging for help. Torrente had Maher's cell phone, which he had given her before going downstairs. She called friends, begging them to contact the police, telling them that intruders were in the building and they were trapped. She could not understand why rescue was taking so long. Her voice, captured in recordings that would later be played in court, grew increasingly desperate. She was having trouble breathing. The smoke was getting worse. Where were the police? Why hadn't anyone come? Edmund Safra was 67 years old and weakened by advanced Parkinson's disease. His lungs could not withstand the assault. He tried using towels soaked in water to filter the air, a desperate measure that provided only temporary relief. As the minutes stretched past an hour, then past 90 minutes, his condition deteriorated. Vivian Torrente, younger and healthier, survived longer, but sealed inside a room designed to be impenetrable, neither had any path to escape. More than 2 hours passed between the first alarm and the moment rescuers finally breached the bathroom door. By then, both Edmund Safra and Vivian Torrente were dead. They had suffocated, overcome by smoke and carbon monoxide, while waiting for help that arrived too late because everyone believed they were hunting armed intruders who did not exist. Lily Safra survived because she was on the opposite side of the residence. Alerted by her maid, she had made her way to a balcony where firefighters, who had been able to reach that section of the building while the search for phantom attackers continued elsewhere, rescued her. She was shaken, but uninjured. The video footage from security cameras that might have documented the exact sequence of events was never recovered. Monaco authorities later explained that the fire's heat had damaged recording equipment. The bodyguards who normally patrolled the residence had been given the evening off. Samuel Cohen had determined that no guards were needed on that particular night. For 4 days, Monaco's authorities investigated the scene, interviewed witnesses, and tried to understand what had happened. They found no evidence of forced entry. They found no trace of the masked intruders. They found accelerants consistent with a deliberately set fire. And they found inconsistencies in Ted Maher's story that grew more difficult to explain with each round of questioning. On December 7th, Monaco's chief prosecutor, Daniel Serde, announced that Maher had confessed. There had been no intruders. The stab wounds were self-inflicted. The entire scenario had been fabricated by a nurse who wanted to impress his employer and feared losing his position. Maher had started the fire, intending to draw attention to himself, Serde told reporters, because he was jealous of other nurses on staff and wanted to prove his value. The confession answered one question and raised dozens more. Ted Maher admitted to starting the fire. He maintained then, and would continue maintaining for decades afterward, that he never meant to kill anyone. The fire was only supposed to be small. The rescue was supposed to be swift. Everything that went wrong resulted from circumstances beyond his control. The fire spreading faster than anticipated, the police misunderstanding the situation, the delays in reaching Safra. Whether any of this mattered, legally or morally, would be determined at trial. Chapter 8. Justice and its Discontents. Ted Maher's trial began on October 16, 2002, nearly 3 years after the fire. The proceedings took place in Monaco's Palais de Justice, a modest building that rarely handled cases of this magnitude or international attention. Journalists from a dozen countries filled the courtroom. Lily Safra attended, sitting in the front row, her presence a constant reminder of what had been lost. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Maher had confessed to starting the fire. Physical evidence confirmed that the blaze originated in the nursing station where he had been working. Medical experts testified that his stab wounds were superficial and consistent with self-infliction. No evidence of forced entry existed. No trace of the alleged intruders had been found. The only logical conclusion was that Maher had staged the entire scenario and lost control of it. The defense argued that Maher's confession had been coerced, extracted after days of intense interrogation in a foreign country, where he did not speak the language and had limited access to legal representation. His attorneys presented him as a man who had made a terrible mistake, but never intended to harm anyone. The fire was supposed to be minor. The plan was foolish but not murderous. What happened afterward resulted from failures by Monaco's emergency services, not from criminal intent. Dominic Dunn, the acclaimed writer who had covered numerous high-profile criminal cases for Vanity Fair, attended the trial and wrote extensively about what he observed. He found Maher's courtroom behavior disturbing. The defendant showed no visible remorse. He seemed disconnected from the gravity of what had occurred. His testimony was evasive, self-serving, and focused on justifying his actions rather than accepting responsibility for their consequences. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. On October 22, 2002, they returned their verdict: guilty of arson leading to the deaths of 2 people. The sentence was 10 years in prison. Maher received less than the prosecution had requested, but far more than the defense had hoped for. 2 months later, he escaped. Using tools he had somehow acquired, reports suggested hacksaw blades smuggled by visitors, Maher cut through the bars of his cell. He fashioned a rope from trash bags tied together and climbed out of the prison building. He made it 15 miles to Nice, France, before police recaptured him 7 hours after his escape. From a payphone, he had called his wife, Heidi, back in the United States. According to her later account, he told her, "It's me, Ted. I'm out. I'm proving how stupid they all are." The escape added years to his sentence and eliminated whatever sympathy might have remained for him. Heidi Maher, who had spent years advocating for her husband's release and maintaining his innocence, began to distance herself. In interviews, she expressed exhaustion and disillusionment. She was coming to believe that the man she had married was not the person she had thought he was. Ted Maher was released in October 2007, having served approximately 8 years. He returned to the United States and attempted to rebuild his life. The effort did not go well. His nursing license was revoked after Texas authorities discovered he had concealed his Monaco conviction on licensing applications. He lost employment repeatedly as publicity surrounding his case made it impossible to escape his past. Prospective employers who learned his identity inevitably declined to hire him. In 2011, Maher gave an interview to ABC News in which he maintained his innocence and claimed that powerful forces had framed him for Safra's death. He suggested, without providing evidence, that Russian organized crime or other enemies of Safra had orchestrated the fire and manipulated him into becoming the scapegoat. The interview generated brief attention but changed nothing about his circumstances. In 2021, he published a book titled Framed in Monte Carlo, in which he detailed his version of events and argued that the investigation had been flawed, the trial had been unfair, and the truth about what happened in Monaco remained hidden. The book received modest attention from true crime enthusiasts, but did not spark any renewed official interest in the case. What happened next revealed something fundamental about Ted Maher that the Monaco trial had perhaps recognized more clearly than outside observers. In 2022, using the alias John Green, he was arrested in Hamilton County, Texas, on charges including burglary, larceny, and fraud. The charges related to his relationship with a woman named Kim Lark, whom he had been dating. According to court documents, he had stolen money and property from her under false pretenses. The following year, while incarcerated and awaiting trial on those charges, Maher was accused of something far worse. Prosecutors alleged that he had conspired with a fellow inmate to murder Kim Lark. The plan, according to evidence presented at trial, involved Maher bonding the other man out of jail so he could go kill Lark via fentanyl overdose and steal money they believed she had hidden. Text messages, recorded conversations, and testimony from the would-be accomplice documented the plot in disturbing detail. In March 2025, Ted Maher was found guilty of solicitation to commit murder. In July, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison, the maximum allowed under Texas law. The man who had insisted for decades that he never meant to harm anyone, that the deaths in Monaco were an accident he could not have foreseen, was now a convicted killer. Not for what happened in 1999, but for plotting to murder a woman who had trusted him in 2023. Ted Mayer is now 67 years old, the same age Edmund Safra was when he died. He is serving his sentence in a Texas prison. If he survives the full term, he will be 76 when he is released. His trajectory over the quarter century since the Monaco fire suggests a pattern that was perhaps visible even then. A man whose craving for recognition exceeded his capacity for judgment, whose fantasies about heroism led him to acts that destroyed others and ultimately himself. Whether Mayer acted entirely alone in Monaco, or whether larger forces exploited his vulnerabilities for their own purposes, remains an open question. What is no longer open to question is the nature of the man himself. His subsequent behavior has demonstrated a willingness to deceive, to steal, and to conspire in violence against someone who trusted him. The Texas conviction does not prove anything about Monaco, but it does suggest that the court in 2002 may have understood Ted Mayer better than many outside observers did. Chapter 9. The questions that remain. The official story is simple. Ted Mayer, a troubled nurse seeking validation, staged a fake emergency that spiraled beyond his control. 2 people died because of his recklessness. Justice was served. For many people, that conclusion is sufficient. For others, it raises more questions than it answers. Their doubts begin with timing. Edmund Safra had spent decades navigating dangerous waters without incident. He had survived the American Express vendetta, which involved a sophisticated corporate campaign designed to destroy his reputation. He had weathered whatever consequences came from providing information to the FBI about Russian money laundering, cooperating with investigators on cases that threatened people who routinely used violence to protect their interests. He had accumulated enemies in boardrooms and in criminal networks that spanned continents. He was weeks away from completing a $10.3 billion transaction that would have allowed him to vanish into protected retirement. The HSBC sale would transfer his client relationships, his operational knowledge, and his institutional connections to a different organization. His value as a target, whether for revenge, for silencing, or for any other purpose, would diminish substantially once the deal closed. He would become a sick, elderly billionaire living quietly in Monaco, no longer at the center of anything that mattered. And then, during those final weeks before the transaction completed, he died. The man responsible had worked, for him, for less than 5 months. Ted Mayer had no prior connection to any of Safra's enemies. He had no history of violence. His motive, according to prosecutors, was nothing more than a desperate desire for recognition. For those inclined to see patterns, the scenario invites suspicion. Could Mayer have been recruited without fully understanding what he was agreeing to? Could someone have suggested the hero scheme to him, knowing how it would likely end? Could a man desperate to prove his worth have been manipulated into destroying himself along with his target? No evidence has emerged to support this theory, but the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. Russian intelligence services and organized crime networks have demonstrated sophisticated capabilities in operations ranging from poisonings to assassinations staged to look like accidents or suicides. If they wanted someone dead, they possessed both the resources and the expertise to make it happen in ways that would deflect investigation. The delays in the rescue operation also raised questions that Monaco authorities never adequately addressed. Police arrived at La Belle Époque within minutes of being alerted. Yet more than 2 hours passed before anyone reached the bathroom where Safra and Torrente were trapped. Officers detained Samuel Cohen, the security chief who could have guided them directly to the victims. Firefighters were held back while the building was cleared for threats that did not exist. Every decision seemed designed to maximize delay rather than minimize it. Incompetence could explain this. Monaco was not accustomed to violent crime. The Principality had fewer than a dozen murders in the entire decade of the 1990s. Its emergency services had little experience with scenarios involving armed intruders in fortified residences. When confronted with Maher's fabricated story, they followed protocols that made sense for a hostage situation, but proved catastrophic for a rescue operation. Or the delays served another purpose entirely. If someone wanted Edmund Safra dead, but needed the death to appear accidental or the result of someone else's actions, ensuring that rescue arrived too late would be essential to the plan. The question is whether such ensuring could have been accomplished, and if so, by whom? Lily Safra's position in the investigation also generated suspicion that has never entirely disappeared. She was married to Edmund for 23 years. She stood to inherit hundreds of millions of dollars from his estate. Her second husband had died under circumstances that his family disputed decades after the fact. And on the night her fourth husband died, several details seemed difficult to explain. Lily occupied a separate suite on the opposite end of the residence, which positioned her to escape while Edmund could not. The bodyguards who normally protected the household had been given the evening off, a decision made by Samuel Cohen, but one that Lily would have been aware of. The video footage from security cameras that might have documented what happened was not recovered. None of this proved anything. But the suspicions lingered. Edmund's surviving brothers, Joseph and Moise Safra, issued a carefully worded statement after the verdict in 2002. They did not accuse anyone directly. They did not endorse the prosecution's conclusion. What they said was this: each person involved in this matter knows in his or her own heart what they did and did not do. They must now live the rest of their lives with this knowledge. The phrasing suggested that the family believed others shared responsibility for what had happened. Whether they meant Monaco authorities, security personnel, Lily, or other figures closer to the investigation, they did not specify. But the statement was notable for what it did not say. It did not declare that justice had been served. It did not express satisfaction with the verdict. It did not close the matter. Dominic Dunn, who investigated the case extensively for Vanity Fair and attended the trial, never fully accepted the official version. He found Maher's behavior strange enough to suggest mental instability, but he was troubled by the larger picture. Too many powerful people had reasons to want Edmund Safra dead. Too many convenient circumstances aligned on the night he died. Dunn reportedly received information suggesting that bullets had been found in Safra's body during the autopsy, which would contradict the established cause of death and imply something far more sinister than accidental death by smoke inhalation. Monaco authorities denied this claim. The official autopsy confirmed that Safra died of carbon monoxide poisoning and smoke inhalation, with no mention of gunshot wounds or any other trauma beyond injuries consistent with attempting to escape the smoke. Whether Dunn's source was mistaken, deliberately lying, or providing accurate information that authorities suppressed remains unknown. The claim added another layer to a case already thick with unanswered questions. 25 years after Edmund Safra's death, resolution remains elusive. Ted Maher maintains that he was framed, that forces beyond his understanding orchestrated events to make him the perfect scapegoat. His subsequent conviction for plotting to murder Kim Lark has not enhanced his credibility. But a guilty man can still tell partial truths, and the circumstances of Edmund Safra's death contain enough anomalies to sustain reasonable doubt. The most honest assessment is this: we do not know with certainty what happened in Monaco on December 3, 1999. We know that Ted Maher started a fire. We know that 2 people died. We know that the man convicted of causing those deaths has spent the decades since demonstrating a pattern of deception and manipulation. Beyond that, certainty dissolves into speculation. Perhaps Maher acted alone, exactly as prosecutors described, and the suspicious circumstances were nothing more than coincidence. Perhaps he was manipulated by forces he has not identified and still does not understand. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between these possibilities, in a territory where individual recklessness intersected with larger agendas in ways that cannot be fully reconstructed. Edmund Safra built his fortune on discretion. The secrets he kept died with him. What happened that night may never be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Chapter 10. Legacy. Edmund Safra left half of his fortune to charity. The Edmund J. Safra Philanthropic Foundation, established after his death, has distributed more than $1 billion to causes he supported during his lifetime: medical research, education, Jewish cultural preservation, and humanitarian relief. The foundation operates across more than 40 countries, funding hospitals, universities, and community organizations that will outlast everyone who remembers the circumstances of his death. His widow devoted the remainder of her life to expanding this work. Lily Safra inherited approximately $800 million and spent the next 2 decades giving most of it away. She endowed the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University, which examines questions of institutional integrity and moral responsibility. She founded the Edmund and Lily Safra Children's Hospital at Sheba Medical Center near Tel Aviv, which treats thousands of young patients each year regardless of their family's ability to pay. She established the Edmund and Lily Safra International Institute of Neuroscience of Natal in Brazil, advancing research into neurological diseases. She built the Edmund J. Safra Family Lodge at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, providing housing for patients and families seeking treatment at the research campus. By the time of her death in July 2022, Lily Safra had donated more than $1.2 billion to charitable causes worldwide. The institutions she funded have educated thousands of students, healed countless patients, and advanced research that will benefit humanity for generations. The whispers about her past followed her to the end. They did not stop her. Whether Lily Safra was a grieving widow who transformed tragedy into philanthropy, or something more complicated, she built institutions that will continue their work long after the questions about her life have been forgotten. The hospitals do not care about the rumors. The scholars receiving fellowships do not investigate the source of their funding. Whatever suspicions surround her life, the concrete achievements of her giving are beyond dispute. The Safra banking dynasty continues without Edmund. His brothers, Joseph and Moise, who had built parallel financial empires in Brazil and elsewhere, maintained the family tradition. Safra National Bank of New York, J. Safra Saracen in Switzerland, Banco Safra in Brazil. The name still appears on institutions managing hundreds of billions in assets. The family that began financing trade caravans in Ottoman Syria now operates one of the largest private banking networks in the world. Joseph Safra, the middle brother, became the richest banker on earth in the years following Edmund's death, with a fortune eventually exceeding $25 billion. He died in December 2020 at the age of 82, leaving the family empire to his children. The dynasty persists, now in its 4th generation, still operating on principles that Edmund helped establish: discretion, reliability, personal relationships. The building at 17 Avenue d'Ostende still stands. La Belle Époque was repaired after the fire that destroyed its upper floors. New residents occupy the space where Edmund and Lily once lived. The damage has been erased. The security systems have been updated. Life continues in one of the world's wealthiest enclaves. Tourists walking past on their way to the casino or the harbor have no reason to know what happened. there unless they remember headlines from a quarter-century ago. Monaco itself has moved on. The principality that was so shaken by violence in its midst has returned to its usual concerns: wealth management, yacht registrations, the Grand Prix, the business of serving the very rich. The Safra case was an aberration, a moment when the dangers of the outside world penetrated a sanctuary designed to exclude them. Nothing like it has happened since. Ted Marr sits in a Texas prison. The man who started this story's final chapter is now 67 years old, the same age Edmund Safra was when he died. Marr is serving 9 years for plotting to murder Kim Lark, his second conviction for actions that endangered or ended lives. He maintains his innocence regarding Monaco. He published his book. He gave his interviews. None of it changed his circumstances or his reputation. His trajectory suggests a pattern that the Monaco court may have recognized more clearly than observers at the time understood. Ted Marr was not a criminal mastermind. He was not a hired assassin. He was something perhaps more dangerous, a man whose craving for recognition exceeded his capacity for judgment, whose fantasies about heroism led him to acts that destroyed others and ultimately himself. Whether larger forces exploited this vulnerability remains an open matter. But the vulnerability was real, and the consequences were catastrophic. In recent years, the case has attracted renewed attention. True crime podcasts have covered it. Documentary producers have examined it. In late 2025, a streaming platform released a series that dramatized the events, interviewed witnesses and investigators, and presented theories about what really happened. 26 years after Edmund Safra suffocated in his bathroom, audiences watched recreations of the fire, heard from people who knew him, and formed their own conclusions. The streaming series sparked debate. Some viewers accepted the official version, a disturbed nurse whose pathetic scheme went horribly wrong. Others embraced more elaborate theories involving Russian intelligence, corporate conspiracies, or Lily Safra's involvement. The comment sections and online forums filled with arguments that will likely never be resolved because the evidence to definitively prove any single theory does not exist and likely never did. This is perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the Edmund Safra case. It contains just enough suspicious circumstances to fuel conspiracy theories, but not enough evidence to confirm any of them. It presents a simple official explanation that accounts for the known facts, but leaves too many questions unanswered for universal acceptance. It offers multiple possible truths, none of which can be entirely proven or disproven. Edmund Safra spent his life protecting wealth. He understood risk better than almost anyone. He built systems designed to withstand threats from competitors, from governments, from criminals. He created layers of security that should have kept him safe from almost anything. In the end, all his precautions failed. The walls he built to keep danger out trapped him with the danger he had invited inside. The smoke that killed him has long since cleared. The investigations have concluded. The trials have ended. The principals are dying or dead. What remains are questions that may outlast everyone who might answer them. And perhaps that is the most fitting legacy for a man who built his fortune on discretion and died under circumstances that will never be fully explained. Epilogue. December 3, 2024, marked the 25th anniversary of Edmund Safra's death. No commemorations were held. No documentaries premiered on that specific date. The anniversary passed largely unnoticed, except by those who still remember, who still wonder, who still believe that the full story has never been told. In Monaco, where fewer than 100 serious crimes occur annually, the case remains the principality's most notorious unsolved mystery, officially solved, yet unofficially doubted. The police officers who responded that night have mostly retired. The prosecutors who tried the case have moved on to other work or left the profession entirely. The journalists who covered the trial have written other stories, covered other scandals, investigated other deaths. But the questions persist. They persist in online forums where amateur investigators dissect every detail of the case. They persist in the minds of people who knew Edmund Safra and cannot reconcile the man they knew with the official explanation of how he died. They persist in the doubts expressed by his brothers, who never fully accepted that Ted Marr acted alone. What is perhaps most remarkable about the case is not what we know, but what we can never know. We cannot know whether Ted Marr was telling the truth when he said he never meant to kill anyone. We cannot know whether anyone else was involved in planning or executing the fire. We cannot know whether the timing of Safra's death, weeks before his $10 billion deal closed, was coincidence or design. We cannot know whether the Russian connections he exposed played any role in his end. We cannot know whether Lily Safra was simply a fortunate survivor or something else entirely. Edmund Safra was one of the richest men in the world. He built his fortune on trust, his reputation on discretion, and his safety on walls that no enemy could penetrate. He surrounded himself with guards, cameras, armored doors, and reinforced rooms designed to withstand any assault. He understood that wealth attracts danger, and he spent decades preparing for threats he could imagine. The threat that killed him was one he invited inside. A nurse, a nobody, a man so desperate for approval that he set a small fire to make himself look heroic. Whether that fire was all there was to the story, or whether it served purposes that Ted Marr himself never fully understood, may never be conclusively determined. The plan was pathetic. The consequences were catastrophic. And whether Marr acted alone or served as someone's instrument, willingly or unwittingly, the result was the same. Edmund Safra, who trusted almost no one, trusted the wrong person at the worst possible moment. His widow became one of the world's great philanthropists, giving away more than $1 billion before her death. His killer became a convict, imprisoned again for plotting another murder. His brothers continued the family business, building the Safra banking empire into one of the largest private financial networks on Earth. His name adorns hospitals and research centers on 4 continents. The building where he died still stands on the Monaco waterfront, repaired and inhabited, its tragic history known only to those who remember or care to research. The man himself is gone. The questions about how he died, and why, and whether the official story tells the complete truth, may follow him into history. Some fortunes cannot be protected no matter how thick the walls or how sophisticated the security. Some fortresses cannot hold against the enemies within. Some stories have no satisfying endings, only conclusions that leave us wondering what really happened in those 18 minutes when everything went wrong. This was one of them. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to the channel. Like the video if it made you think, and leave a comment if you have theories, questions, or information about the case that others should consider. The truth about what happened in Monaco on December 3rd, 1999, may still be waiting to be discovered. Or it may be lost forever, buried with the man who died waiting for rescue that never came. Thank you for watching. The investigation that wouldn't die. 26 years have passed since Edmund Safra died in his Monaco penthouse. The case was officially closed in 2002 when Ted Marr's conviction became final. Yet the investigation, in certain circles, has never truly ended. What keeps it alive is not conspiracy theorists posting on obscure forums. What keeps it alive are the specific, documented anomalies that professional investigators found troubling then and find troubling now. These are not wild speculations. These are procedural irregularities that appear in court records, witness statements, and forensic reports. They do not prove a conspiracy, but they raise questions that Monaco's authorities never adequately addressed. Consider the timeline. Monaco police received the first emergency call at 4:45 a.m. Officers arrived on scene within 7 minutes, an impressive response by any standard. They found Ted Marr in the lobby, bleeding from stab wounds, claiming armed intruders were still in the building. His story triggered protocols designed for active threat scenarios. Police treated the situation as a hostage crisis with potentially armed assailants barricaded inside a fortified residence. This decision was not unreasonable. Monaco had experienced terrorist incidents in the past. The Safra household was a high-value target. An American nurse covered in blood reporting an armed invasion deserved to be taken seriously. What happened next, however, suggests either profound incompetence or something more troubling. Samuel Cohen, Safra's security chief, arrived approximately 15 minutes after police. He immediately identified himself and offered to guide officers to his employer's location. He had keys. He knew which room Safra would retreat to during an emergency. He could have led rescuers directly to the reinforced bathroom where the billionaire and Vivian Torrente were trapped. Instead, police detained him. They handcuffed the one person capable of expediting the rescue and held him for interrogation while smoke filled the upper floors. The official explanation was standard procedure. Cohen had not been positively identified. Officers could not know whether he was genuinely Safra's security chief or an accomplice attempting to infiltrate the building. Monaco's police followed protocols designed to prevent additional threats from entering an active scene. This explanation satisfies some observers. It does not satisfy everyone. Cohen was not a random person claiming authority. He carried identification. He had security credentials for the building. Multiple staff members could have verified his identity within minutes. Yet he remained restrained, while Edmund Safra suffocated 3 floors above him. The decision to prioritize verification over rescue in a situation where every second mattered resulted in the death of Monaco's most prominent resident. No one in the police command structure faced disciplinary action for this choice. The delay in reaching the trapped victims exceeded 2 hours. During this time, firefighters waited outside while police cleared the building room by room, searching for assailants who existed only in Meyer's fabrication. Fire suppression systems that could have controlled the blaze remained inactive. The armored door to Safra's dressing room, designed to resist forced entry, also resisted rescue efforts. When crews finally breached the chamber at 7:15 a.m., both occupants had been dead for approximately 30 minutes. Dr. Patrick Raybaud, the forensic pathologist who examined the bodies, determined that Edmund Safra and Vivian Torrente died from carbon monoxide poisoning combined with thermal asphyxiation. The report noted soot in their airways, indicating they had inhaled smoke for an extended period before losing consciousness. The positioning of the bodies suggested they had remained near the door, attempting to create an opening that would allow fresh air to enter. These efforts failed. The room was simply too well sealed. What the forensic report did not explain was certain injuries documented on Safra's body. The autopsy recorded bruising on his arms and torso that appeared inconsistent with the circumstances of his death. Dr. Raybaud attributed these marks to the chaos of the rescue operation and the subsequent movement of the body. Others found this explanation inadequate. Bruising patterns suggested force applied before death, not after. When pressed during the trial, Raybaud maintained his conclusions, but acknowledged that determining the precise timing of such injuries was difficult given the condition of the remains. Dominic Dunn, the Vanity Fair writer who attended much of Meyer's trial, reported hearing rumors that bullet fragments had been recovered during the autopsy. He was never able to confirm this claim. Monaco authorities denied it categorically. No ballistic evidence appeared in the official forensic documentation. Yet the rumor persisted, circulating among journalists who covered the case and investigators who found other aspects of the official narrative troubling. Whether this represented genuine information from a confidential source or simply the kind of speculation that accumulates around sensational cases remains unclear. What is documented, however, is that certain physical evidence from the scene was never properly accounted for. Security camera footage that should have captured the hours leading up to the fire was reported missing or corrupted. The hard drives containing this data were examined by forensic technicians who determined that segments had been overwritten or damaged beyond recovery. Whether this resulted from a technical malfunction, the fire itself, or deliberate tampering could not be established. The absence of video evidence became particularly significant during Meyer's trial. Prosecutors relied heavily on his confession and the physical evidence of the fire to establish guilt. They did not need to explain how he moved through the apartment, what he did in the minutes before setting the blaze, or whether anyone else was present. The security system that was supposed to document everything had failed at precisely the moment documentation mattered most. Monaco's lead prosecutor, Daniel Serdet, addressed this gap by noting that Meyer's own statements provided sufficient detail to reconstruct events. Defense attorneys argued that the missing footage represented exculpatory evidence that might have supported their client's claims of being manipulated. The judge ruled the footage inadmissible on grounds that it no longer existed. These procedural irregularities do not prove Meyer was framed. They do not establish that powerful forces orchestrated his actions, but they create space for reasonable doubt that Monaco's judicial system never adequately addressed. The case moved forward on the strength of a confession obtained under circumstances that Meyer would later contest. Whether that confession represented the truth or merely what an isolated, frightened man believed his captors wanted to hear remains a matter of interpretation. The Russian question. Of all the theories surrounding Edmund Safra's death, the Russian connection generates the most persistent speculation. This is not because evidence directly links his killing to Moscow. It is because the timeline, the methods, and the beneficiaries align too neatly with patterns established in dozens of other cases, where individuals who threatened powerful Russian interests met untimely ends. Safra's involvement with the Russian money laundering investigation began in 1998. He had contacted FBI agents working organized crime cases in New York after noticing transactions flowing through Republic National Bank accounts that appeared suspicious. The amounts were staggering, sometimes exceeding hundreds of millions of dollars in a single day. The funds originated from Russian entities whose legitimate business operations could not plausibly generate such revenue. They moved through shell companies registered in Caribbean tax havens, then dispersed to accounts across Europe and the United States. The FBI investigation that followed would eventually implicate the Bank of New York in one of the largest money laundering schemes ever documented. Between 1996 and 1999, approximately $4.8 billion had been transferred through accounts controlled by Semyon Mogilevich, a Ukrainian-born organized crime figure whom the FBI had been tracking for years. Mogilevich operated at the intersection of Russian government power, organized crime networks, and legitimate business enterprises in ways that made him effectively untouchable. He had connections to intelligence services, to politicians at the highest levels of government, and to criminal organizations that controlled everything from energy infrastructure to human trafficking. Safra had not provided information about Mogilevich directly. His role was narrower and more technical. He had identified suspicious patterns in accounts that Republic maintained for certain Russian clients. These clients were not marquee names. They were mid-level operators whose transactions suggested they were moving money for someone else. When FBI agents followed these trails, they led to Bank of New York, to Mogilevich, and eventually to networks that extended into the Kremlin itself. By late 1999, the investigation had progressed to the point where indictments were being prepared. Federal prosecutors in Manhattan were building cases that would implicate not just Mogilevich's associates, but potentially Russian government officials who had benefited from the scheme. The International Monetary Fund loan that had been diverted represented Russian taxpayer money stolen by the very people tasked with managing it. Exposing this theft carried significant political consequences. It threatened careers, fortunes, and the carefully constructed networks through which post-Soviet Russia's new elite had secured their wealth. Edmund Safra was not the only person who had cooperated with investigators, but he was among the most prominent. His institutions held accounts for individuals whose exposure would create cascading failures across the entire structure. If Safra were compelled to testify, if his records were subpoenaed, if his detailed knowledge of how the money moved became public, the damage would be severe. Then, in December 1999, he died. The timing was remarkable. Not early enough to completely derail the investigation, but early enough to eliminate a witness whose testimony would have been devastating. Mogilevich himself was never convicted. He remained in Russia, beyond the reach of American extradition. Some of his associates faced charges, but the core of the network survived intact, largely because key evidence that might have connected them to the highest levels of Russian power was never secured. Those who suspect Russian involvement in Safra's death point to this outcome as evidence. The investigation continued after his death, but without his cooperation, prosecutors lost crucial leverage. Accounts were closed, records disappeared, witnesses became uncooperative. The cases that were brought resulted in plea bargains and minor sentences. The people at the top remained untouched. The method, if one accepts that Safra's death was anything other than Ted Maher's bungled hero fantasy, fits established patterns. Russian intelligence services had long employed techniques designed to create plausible deniability. Assassinations were staged to look like accidents, suicides, or the work of unstable individuals. Polonium poisoning, falls from windows, car accidents on isolated roads, fires in fortified residences. The use of an expendable intermediary was standard practice. Find someone desperate, someone with access, someone whose own circumstances make them vulnerable to manipulation. Offer them what they need, whether that is money, security, or simply the validation they crave. Guide them toward actions that serve the larger objective without ever explaining what that objective is. When the operation concludes, the intermediary is arrested, prosecuted, and left to carry the blame alone. They do not know enough to implicate anyone else. They were a tool, discarded once its purpose was served. Ted Maher fits this profile with disturbing precision. He was drowning in debt. He faced losing custody of his son. He desperately needed the generous Safra salary and feared he was about to lose it. He craved recognition and respect that his actual accomplishments had not earned. These psychological vulnerabilities made him exactly the kind of asset intelligence operatives specialize in recruiting. Could someone have suggested the hero scheme to him, knowing how it would end? Could he have been provided with materials or guidance that ensured the fire would spread beyond control? Could the missing security footage and the unusual absence of bodyguards that night have been arranged by someone with access to the household's operations? These questions do not have answers. What is documented, however, is that Russia has a long history of eliminating problematic individuals using methods designed to appear accidental or attributable to lone actors. Alexander Litvinenko, poisoned with polonium in London. Sergei Magnitsky, beaten to death in a Moscow prison. Boris Nemtsov, shot on a bridge near the Kremlin. Anna Politkovskaya, murdered in her apartment building. The list extends across decades and continents. Each case shares certain characteristics. The victim had threatened powerful interests. The method created ambiguity about responsibility. The investigation, when it occurred, either stalled or resulted in convictions of peripheral figures, while the architects remained protected. Edmund Safra's death does not definitively belong on this list, but it shares enough features to warrant serious examination that Monaco's authorities never conducted. The Principality's investigation focused exclusively on Meyer. They did not pursue whether he had been in contact with anyone who might have influenced his actions. They did not examine his financial records for unusual deposits or payments. They did not investigate whether anyone else had entered the residence that night, despite missing security footage and inconsistencies in staff accounts. Monaco wanted the case closed quickly. The Principality's reputation depends on being a safe haven for the world's wealthiest individuals. A billionaire dying violently in one of its most secure buildings was a catastrophe for that brand. Attributing the death to a disturbed American nurse provided a conclusion that minimized broader concerns. If the cause was one man's psychological instability rather than a failure of Monaco's security infrastructure or the penetration of Russian intelligence operations into its borders, wealthy residents could continue to feel safe. Whether this desire for reassuring closure prevented a more thorough investigation is a matter of interpretation. What is certain is that questions remain unanswered because they were never seriously pursued. Lily's shadow. Lily Safra outlived her husband by nearly 23 years. She spent those years transforming their shared fortune into charitable institutions that have improved countless lives. The Safra name now adorns hospitals, research centers, and university buildings across 4 continents. Her philanthropy was genuine, substantial, and strategically focused on causes, medical research, child welfare, neuroscience, that reflect serious engagement rather than vanity projects. Yet the questions about her role in Edmund's death have never fully dissipated. They linger in footnotes, in true crime forums, and in conversations among those who find the official narrative inadequate. The suspicions are not based on evidence of direct wrongdoing. They are based on patterns, coincidences, and the undeniable fact that she was the primary beneficiary of his death. Lily had been married 4 times. Her second husband, Alfredo Monteverde, died in 1969 under circumstances his family contested. The official ruling was suicide by gunshot. The Monteverde family insisted this was impossible, pointing to Alfredo's stable mental state, his successful business, and his apparent contentment in the days before his death. They believed Lily had been involved. Brazilian authorities disagreed. No charges were filed. But the family's suspicions became part of the permanent record, occasionally resurfacing when journalists investigated her background. Her marriage to Edmund in 1976 had made her the wife of one of the world's wealthiest bankers. His death in 1999 made her one of the richest women in Europe. She inherited an estimated $800 million to $1 billion, the exact figure depending on which assets are included in the calculation. The Safra fortune, built across 3 generations, now belonged to a woman whose previous husband had died in disputed circumstances and whose current husband had perished in a fire that raised questions Monaco's authorities declined to pursue. This inheritance pattern alone does not prove anything. Spouses routinely inherit estates. Wealthy men often marry women younger than themselves who outlive them. That Lily benefited financially from Edmund's death is unremarkable. What generates suspicion is the combination of factors surrounding the night he died. She occupied a separate suite on the opposite end of the penthouse. This arrangement was well documented and arose from practical considerations related to Edmund's medical care. He required constant monitoring, medications administered throughout the night, and equipment that generated noise incompatible with restful sleep. Maintaining separate quarters made sense, but it also meant that Lily was positioned to escape the fire, while Edmund was not. She reached a balcony and was rescued by firefighters relatively early in the response operation. Edmund, trapped behind armored walls in a sealed bathroom, suffocated while emergency crews searched for phantom intruders. The physical layout of the residence meant that Lily was never in serious danger. Whether this was coincidence or design depends on whether one believes the fire was truly accidental. The bodyguards who normally protected the household were absent that night. Samuel Cohen, the security chief, had determined they were not needed. This decision was later described as routine cost-saving during a period when Edmund rarely left the residence and faced no specific threats. Others found the timing suspicious. On the one night when an actual threat materialized or was manufactured, the professional security personnel who might have prevented or quickly contained the disaster were not present. Security camera footage that would have documented who entered and exited the residence in the hours before the fire was reported missing or corrupted. The hard drives that stored this data were examined by forensic technicians who concluded that key segments had been lost. Whether this resulted from the fire, technical malfunction, or deliberate tampering could not be determined. What is certain is that the absence of this footage made it impossible to verify exactly who was where when events began to unfold. These circumstances do not prove Lily's involvement. They prove only that several factors that might have prevented Edmund's death or documented what truly happened were absent or compromised. Whether this resulted from tragic coincidence or careful planning remains contested. Edmund's surviving brothers, Joseph and Moise, issued a statement after Meyer's conviction that many interpreted as directed at Lily. They wrote, "Each knows what they did and did not do. They must now live the rest of their lives with this knowledge." The phrasing was deliberately ambiguous. It did not accuse anyone directly, but it suggested the family believed others shared responsibility for what had occurred. Lily did not respond publicly to this statement. Her attorneys issued brief comments emphasizing her grief and her commitment to honoring Edmund's legacy through charitable work. She did not grant interviews about the fire. She did not participate in documentaries examining the case. She maintained dignified silence while building the philanthropic empire that now carries the Safra name. Those inclined to see her as innocent point to this record of giving. Would a woman who had murdered her husband for his fortune spend decades distributing that fortune to strangers? The cynical response is that philanthropy serves many purposes, including reputation management. The more charitable interpretation is that grief and guilt can coexist, that a woman who benefited from her husband's death might genuinely wish to do good with the resources that came to her. Lily Safra died in July 2022 at the age of 87. She was buried alongside Edmund in Geneva. Whatever she knew about the events of December 3, 1999, she carried to her grave. The brothers who suspected her involvement have not elaborated publicly. The questions that swirled around her throughout the final decades of her life remain questions still. The culture of silence. Monaco is not merely a place where rich people live. It is a machine designed to protect rich people, and that machine operates through discretion enforced by law and culture. The principality's entire economic model depends on wealthy individuals believing they can reside there without scrutiny, publicity, or interference. What happens in Monaco stays in Monaco, not because of any official slogan, but because everyone from police to press understands that maintaining this reputation is essential. This culture shaped the investigation into Edmund Safra's death in ways that became apparent only in retrospect. Monaco's authorities wanted the case resolved quickly and quietly. A narrative that attributed the tragedy to one disturbed employee minimized broader concerns about security failures or external threats penetrating the principality's borders. Ted Mayer provided a convenient solution. He had confessed. He had obvious psychological issues. He fit the profile of a lone actor whose recklessness required no deeper investigation. The trial reflected this urgency. Proceedings moved rapidly. Defense requests for additional time to investigate were largely denied. Maher's attorneys argued they needed access to security records, financial documents, and witness interviews that might establish whether their client had been manipulated by external forces. The court ruled that Maher's confession and the physical evidence were sufficient. Introducing speculation about Russian intelligence operations or conspiracies involving Lily Safra would only prolong proceedings and generate publicity that served no one's interests. This approach was not unique to Monaco. Investigations into deaths of prominent individuals often face pressure to reach conclusions that preserve institutional credibility and public confidence. When those individuals died in circumstances that raise uncomfortable questions about security failures or systemic vulnerabilities, authorities face incentives to minimize complexity. A clean narrative is easier to prosecute, easier to explain, and easier to move past. Monaco's decision to pursue this approach meant that certain lines of inquiry were never followed. No serious investigation examined whether Maher had been in contact with anyone who might have influenced his actions. His phone records were not scrutinized for calls to unknown numbers. His bank accounts were not examined for unusual deposits. Witnesses who might have seen him interacting with individuals outside the household were not systematically interviewed. The missing security footage was treated as an unfortunate technical failure rather than potential evidence of tampering. No independent forensic examination determined whether the data loss resulted from the fire or from deliberate destruction. The absence of video documentation simply became an accepted limitation rather than a suspicious gap requiring explanation. Samuel Cohen, the security chief whose detention delayed the rescue, was never publicly questioned about why bodyguards were absent that night. His decision was described as routine and never scrutinized. Whether he received instructions to reduce security presence, whether he had been influenced by anyone with ulterior motives, whether his actions that night warranted closer examination, these questions were not pursued. The investigation concluded that Ted Maher acted alone, that his motive was pathetic validation-seeking, and that the deaths resulted from his reckless incompetence rather than intentional murder. This conclusion satisfied Monaco's judicial system. It did not satisfy everyone who examined the evidence. Dominic Dunn, whose reporting for Vanity Fair brought sustained attention to the case, found Monaco's rush to closure troubling. He believed the authorities had foreclosed avenues of investigation that might have revealed a more complex picture. His articles raised questions that Monaco officials dismissed as sensationalism. Whether Dunn was a diligent journalist pursuing legitimate concerns or a conspiracy theorist chasing shadows depends largely on one's assessment of the evidence he highlighted. What is indisputable is that Monaco's culture of discretion shapes how such cases are handled. Transparency is not a value the principality prizes. Privacy is. When those two principles come into conflict during a high-profile investigation, privacy tends to win. The result is that certain questions simply never get answered because asking them too persistently threatens the system that everyone benefits from maintaining. Edmund Safra chose Monaco precisely because of this discretion. The fortress he built was not just physical walls and armored doors. It was a legal and cultural structure designed to keep prying eyes away from his business, his assets, and his life. That same structure ultimately limited how thoroughly his death could be investigated. The machine he trusted to protect him also protected those who might have wished him harm. The story continues in ways that may never fully resolve. The Netflix documentary releasing in December 2025 will introduce new audiences to the case, generate fresh speculation, and perhaps surface witnesses or evidence that previous investigations overlooked. Or it will simply rehearse the same unanswered questions that have circulated for a quarter century, packaging them with dramatic reenactments and ominous music that suggests certainty where none exists. What remains are the facts that cannot be disputed. Edmund Safra died in a fire. Started by Ted Mayer. Mayer acted with catastrophic recklessness, regardless of whether he acted alone. 2 people suffocated in a reinforced room, while rescue operations focused on threats that did not exist. A billionaire's fortress became his tomb. And the questions about whether larger forces shaped these events have outlived most of the principals who might answer them. The Safra case became a textbook study in how extreme wealth creates paradoxes that most people never confront. Security experts have analyzed Edmund Safra's death for 2.5 decades, and their conclusions contain lessons that extend far beyond one billionaire's tragedy. The first paradox: the more protection you add, the more vulnerability you create. Safra's penthouse contained multiple redundant security systems, each designed to prevent a specific threat. But those systems required maintenance, staffing, codes, and protocols. Every additional layer introduced new people into the inner circle: guards who needed briefing, technicians who serviced equipment, nurses who rotated through shifts. Each person represented a potential point of failure. The fortress required an army to operate, and someone in that army eventually destroyed it from within. Security consultants now refer to this as the Safra problem. When you design defenses so sophisticated that rescue becomes impossible, you have transformed protection into imprisonment. Modern panic rooms incorporate lessons learned from Avenue d'Ostende. They include independent oxygen supplies, external communication systems that cannot be disabled from inside the residence, and override mechanisms that allow emergency services to breach them within minutes rather than hours. These modifications exist because Edmund Safra suffocated behind walls that were too strong. The second paradox involves trust itself. Safra spent his career understanding that relationships were the foundation of banking. He knew his clients personally. He remembered their children's names. He attended their weddings and their funerals. This personal approach built loyalty that institutions could not replicate. But it also meant that Safra understood, perhaps better than most, how rare genuine trust actually was. Yet his final years required him to trust strangers with his most vulnerable moments. The progression of Parkinson's disease meant surrendering privacy to people who possessed nursing degrees but no meaningful connection to him. Ted Maher had worked for the Safra household for 137 days when he started the fire. Less than 5 months. In that time, he had administered medications, monitored vital signs, and been present during moments when Edmund Safra could not protect himself. The intimacy of medical care forces a kind of trust that wealth cannot eliminate. You can vet someone's credentials. You can investigate their background. You cannot know what they will do when desperation or delusion takes hold. The question of whether Maher acted alone has consumed investigators, journalists, and conspiracy theorists for decades. But the question itself may be less important than the conditions that made his actions possible. Whether Ted Marr was a lone actor or someone's instrument, the fundamental problem remained the same. The person responsible for protecting Safra's life decided to threaten it instead. No security system can defend against that. Intelligence agencies have studied the case for precisely this reason. Assassination methods have evolved considerably since the Cold War. Poisoned umbrellas and exotic toxins still exist, but sophisticated operations now focus on exploiting the target's own vulnerabilities. You do not need to penetrate the fortress if you can recruit someone already inside, and you do not need to recruit them as an assassin. You simply need to manipulate them into creating conditions where death becomes likely. Did someone identify Ted Marr as vulnerable? Did someone plant the hero scenario in his mind, knowing how a man desperate for validation might act on such a suggestion? Did someone ensure that the guards would be absent, that the security chief would be detained, that the rescue would be delayed? The evidence to support this theory has never emerged. But the operational elegance of the outcome, an untraceable death, an obvious scapegoat, and no conspiracy that could be proven, has kept the theory alive. The third paradox concerns money itself. Edmund Safra could afford any protection available. He employed guards trained by intelligence services. He purchased surveillance systems more sophisticated than those used by many governments. He lived in a building that was effectively a vertical fortress. And yet all that wealth could not save him from a wastebasket fire started by an insecure employee. Contrast his death with those of ordinary people who survive house fires every year. They escape through windows. They crawl through smoke to reach exits. They are rescued by neighbors who break down doors. Safra's wealth eliminated these ordinary escape routes. His windows were reinforced. His doors required codes and keys that rescuers did not possess. His neighbors were floors away, separated by bank vaults and security barriers. The very precautions that were supposed to protect him ensured that when something went wrong, no simple solution existed. Estate attorneys who specialize in ultra-high net worth clients now discuss the Safra case as an example of security theater, measures that create the appearance of protection while introducing new risks. The lesson they draw is uncomfortable. Beyond a certain threshold, additional security spending produces diminishing returns or actively increases vulnerability. The optimal security arrangement for most people, even very wealthy people, may be far less elaborate than Edmund Safra believed necessary. But this assumes his threat assessment was wrong. And perhaps it was not. Perhaps the danger he feared was real, and the fortress he built was the only reason he survived as long as he did. Perhaps powerful people had been trying to reach him for years, and the defenses that failed on December 3, 1999, had succeeded on dozens of previous occasions. We know about the attack that worked. We know nothing about the attacks that were deterred. This possibility haunts those who worked closest to Safra. His brothers have never spoken publicly about what threats they believe their sibling faced. But their statement after the verdict, that each person involved must live with what they did or did not do, suggested more than grief. It suggested knowledge of circumstances that were never fully disclosed. The final paradox is philosophical. Edmund Safra built his fortune through caution. He trusted carefully. He diversified risk. He prepared for disasters that never occurred. Every precaution reflected a worldview in which vigilance was the price of survival. And in the end, that very vigilance, the rotating nurses, the security protocols, the reinforced rooms, created the conditions for his death. Would he have lived if he had been less careful? If he had maintained simpler security arrangements? If he had accepted that some risks cannot be eliminated? Perhaps. Or perhaps someone would have reached him years earlier, and we would be analyzing a different tragedy. There is no way to know. What we do know is this. 26 years after his death, the questions remain unresolved. Netflix dramatizes the case. Investigators revisit the evidence, writers publish new theories, and none of it brings Edmund Safra back or explains with certainty why he died, when and how he did. The most honest conclusion may be the least satisfying. The case demonstrates how money, power, and protection create their own gravitational fields, bending the trajectory of events in ways that resist simple explanation. Ted Marr set a fire. That much is certain. Everything else, the motives, the conspiracies, the unanswered questions about timing and access, and who knew what when, exists in the territory between fact and speculation, where truth becomes indistinguishable from the stories we tell about it. Edmund Safra's legacy is not merely the hospitals and research centers that bear his name. It is also the unresolved mystery of his death, a case that continues to fascinate precisely because it resists closure. The billionaire who trusted almost no one died because he trusted the wrong person. Whether that person acted alone or served larger purposes, we may never fully understand. The fortress could not save him. The answers may remain forever out of reach. Some mysteries are meant to endure.